Alright guys, Murphs here, and today we're going to talk about the development of modern self-contained ammunition. We're going to talk about extremely important steps that were taken along the way that got us to where we are today, as well as some interesting side quests that history seems to have forgotten, or at least aren't very talked about very often. We have a tendency today to take self-contained ammunition for granted. However, in the period of time that gunpowder has existed, that has not always necessarily been the case. Now, for the origin of gunpowder, we go back to sometime in the 11th century. People are not necessarily for sure, or at least anything that I have found has not been able to give like a coherent, this date is when gunpowder came into existence, especially once you start to talk about its use in fireworks, then transitioning over into actual like military type uses. But when we characterize the early use of black powder, what we're talking about are very simple hand cannons and actual cannons in which you would pour propellant down a hollow tube that was closed off at one end. You would then add your projectile, and then you would touch a match to a hole that would allow the flame to be able to reach the propellant and send that round down range. So we have a lot of gas blow by. This is not a time where we really understand like ballistics and all those types of things. We know that this thing goes bang, and it sends an object that direction that could potentially kill somebody. Now, early black powder would not necessarily penetrate armor, not in the hand cannon sense. If you came up against an actual cannon hurling its cannonball at you, then yes, it would absolutely destroy castle walls and be very complicated for anybody who got in its way. And we have this separate loading system that's going on here, and this would persist well into the 1800s. So eventually someone would be like, man, it's actually really inconvenient for me to hold this piece of wrought iron and then apply like this match to it. What if we assemble this contraption that had the match mounted to the gun so that we could pull a lever and then that would drop the match, the lit match, to my propellant so I could spark it up and send it off. Then this would eventually give advent to the flintlock, where you would have a hammer that mounted a piece of flint that would strike against some iron, that would send a cascade of sparks into the frizzen, and then the round would discharge that way. We're still talking about separate loading systems at this point. We're just talking about different ways of being able to set off the propellant, because in our journey to get to the self-propelled cartridge, we have to figure out how to combine projectile, propellant, and some means of initiation. And then this brings us to the cap lock, which became very popular in the 1800s, where you had a nipple on the gun in which you would put a primer. And a primer has a small amount of explosive in it, like mercury fulminate or something along those lines. And then the hammer of the gun would come down, smack the primer, and that would discharge a spike to the propellant, sending the round down range. Now we have an extremely efficient manner of ignition. Not just in that, like, oh, well, I have to hope that I get enough like sparks in there, or I have to hope that my match doesn't go out or something like that, but also in that's the reliability of the ignition at that point, but also the force of the ignition. If you talk a lot about like flintlocks or match guns and matchlocks and all that kind of stuff, what happens is sometimes you pull the trigger and there's a minor delay before the full powder charge goes. In addition to there being a lot of ejecta coming out of the frizzen as well, which is why, like, if you ever watch The Patriot, sometimes you see English and American soldiers turning their faces away from their guns because there's a big plume of smoke that's going to come out and potentially blind them. That was very common for the time period. The cap lock eliminates that, which makes the cap lock very interesting. So now we have a very reliable means of initiation. We have propellant, we have projectile. How do we combine the three? And there was a lot of research that was done into this at this time. Now, something that was done to speed up the loading process was actually issuing out little packets of ammunition. So you would have a linen or paper tube that had your propellant in one side and the projectile on the other. You tear open the one side, pour the propellant down the barrel, and then you could use the remainder of the wrapping with your projectile to be your wadding so that you could then get your primer on there and send the round down range. In general, separate loading, of course, is much slower than having a full-up cartridge that you can just insert into the chamber. But we're not yet there technology-wise. So having everything loaded up into a convenient packet instead of having to grab your powder horn, pour that down there, retrieve your projectile, slam that in there, and then find your primer and put that on there. You can see where this would make loading a lot more rapid, but not as rapid as it could be. In addition to that, whenever it is that we talk about this separate loading system, we have several flaws. So first off, transportation and storage of the powder. So having a whole bunch of loose powder around is potentially very detrimental to any structures that you might be storing it in. So the powder house or magazine at a fortress or on a ship or something along those lines. There are many instances in which ships have been lost because of powder magazines going up. The USS Arizona would be a fantastic recent example. Now, in addition to that, if you're talking about having your ammunition stored in a specific yard and a cannonball should happen to hit that, your whole ammunition stockpile goes up at once, also probably causing irreparable damage to whatever structure it is that's holding that. This has always been a concern of ASPs and ammunition holding areas and all that kind of stuff, which is getting down a little bit of a rabbit hole of like different advancements in explosives. We're just talking about propellant right now, so I'm not going to do that to you. Oh, that's quite good. I've been drinking mostly scotch here lately, but this bourbon is a refreshing change of pace. All right, so in addition to the storage hazards that are associated with black powder or loose powder, you also have the environmental concerns. If your powder gets wet, it's not going to ignite, and this is incredibly problematic. And this is where when we have the transition process from like having swordsmen and lancers and all those types of things, and we have more and more guns, this becomes really problematic because in an earlier army where your use of firearms was basically just supposed to supplement like your archers, like a closer range salvo type effect of archers, you still had pikemen, you still had cavalry armed with lances and all those types of things so that you could close with and destroy the enemy. When your army is entirely run by firearms, they need propellant. Otherwise, they are stuck with doing bayonet charges. You just took very modern infantry and turned them into spearmen for absolutely no reason. That's something that you have to be concerned about whenever we talk about this. But also, the proper loading sequence. There are many examples that were found during the American Civil War in which soldiers, scared out of their wits, would load their firearm multiple times but forget to put a primer on the nipple. They would shoulder the rifle and pull the trigger and not be able to distinguish their firearm discharging from everyone else's because they're just that scared out of their wits. So there were many times where rifles were recovered with multiple charges down the bore, as well as occasionally somebody would remember mid, several missed opportunities of putting a primer on their gun that, oh crap, I need to put a primer on this. They get that primer on there and now they try to discharge a firearm with more than one load in it and the gun explodes. Not very helpful to anybody. So you introduce more opportunities for failure when you have a separate loading system and then you induce stress. So of course, there was a lot of interest in refining this overall system, making this more efficient, not just from a storage standpoint, not just from a longevity standpoint, but also from a getting more rounds down range standpoint. So with that, several innovations would come out. The first one I want to start with, because I find it very interesting, is actually a very early version of caseless ammunition, something we're going to talk about more here in a minute. And this was the ammunition used in the Volcanic lever-action pistols. That ammunition had a projectile with a hollow base packed with propellant and then a primer placed over the end of it. Now, these were not good. This was not good ammunition. The projectiles were relatively lightweight. That wasn't a lot of propellant, so they weren't reaching very high velocities, which means they didn't have a lot of energy. And it's not something that you would see catch on and take off over time. Another notable evolution during this time period was actually in Sharps carbines, in which Sharps created ammunition that was a linen stick of propellant that had a projectile mounted on top of it. So you can go ahead and load that in your rifle, close it up, close up the breech. So now we've introduced breech loading instead of having to muzzle stuff. And then you place a primer on the nipple and set the round down range. So now we've managed to combine propellant and projectile, but the primer's still hanging out on its own. And this led us into our next really good step in this overall process, which is the needle gun. Now, I'm going a little bit out of order as far as like sequentially when these things came out with, as much as I'm getting after the concept of being able to combine all these things. Now, what is a needle gun? Well, it's a gun that has a firing pin that's very long and thin and shaped like a needle, and it used ammunition that would best work with that. So this was actually a very thin brass-cased cartridge. Had a projectile set in the nose and had propellant behind it. And it had a primer set inside of the cartridge casing. The needle would penetrate through the thin brass, through a couple of like wads and spacers and stuff like that, and impinge the primer, sending the round down range. So now we've even introduced metal and we've combined all of the aspects. We have propellant, we have primer, we have projectile inside of a self-contained cartridge going downrange. However, the needle gun didn't really catch on. It did better than some options. Another notable design feature another notable innovation from the time period was pinfire. And this one actually takes a little bit of a different approach here. So we have a brass cartridge casing filled with propellant with a projectile on top, but a pin protruding from the rim of the cartridge casing. So the hammer would come down and hit the firing pin that is now built into the ammunition, which would impinge the primer, ignite the propellant, and send the round down range. Now, for very obvious reasons, this type of ammunition caught on but didn't necessarily have any staying power. And a lot of this has to do with the fact that it primarily only worked with breech-loading firearms and like revolvers. Trying to get it into a lever action gun or any type of more modern single-shot repeating arm didn't... Single-shot repeating arm is an oxymoron. Any type of manually cycled action involving a magazine tube was not going to benefit utilizing a pinfire cartridge. That's what I'm trying to get after. But what would? And that is where we get rimfires. Starting off with the Smith & Wesson #1 pistol chambered in 22 short. This, of course, is a relatively anemic cartridge, but it gave somebody multiple shot firepower in a self-contained metallic cartridge and a semi-reliable means of initiation. Now, what is a rimfire in this case? Where if we would have talked about pinfire, and that sounds pretty similar, like the firing pins protruding out of the rim. But in this case, we have metal cartridge casing filled with propellant, topped off with a projectile, and the primer compound is spread around the rim of the cartridge casing itself. So this way you can strike anywhere on that rim and it'll discharge the round. It'll ignite the propellant. That's pretty interesting. And this idea would be expounded upon in the Henry lever-action rifle chambered in .44 rimfire. Also a relatively anemic cartridge for its time period, but providing multi-shot capability and something that's still more potent than a .22 is pretty fantastic. And this would be a very popular rifle during the American Civil War for those who could afford it. And then more so afterwards. Okay. So now we've gotten to rimfire cartridges, Murph. That's pretty fantastic. And rimfires would stick around for a little bit, even achieving actual full-scale military adoption. However, it wouldn't be too much longer before the centerfire primed cartridge came along, which came with a more reliable primer, and then, of course, all the other things that we've talked about beforehand. So metal cartridge casing, propellant, and then projectile mounted on top. The centerfire cartridge is the best aspect of all this evolution. We've finally gotten the self-contained cartridge that is now reliable. Or the most reliable that it can be. The most efficient that it can be. And this ammunition would continue to go on through its advancements. We get into the late 1800s where we have smokeless powder and then Spitzer bullets shortly after that. And next cartridge casings and blah, 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 blah. All these types of things happen. So innovation more or less stagnates. Not necessarily, because what becomes very interesting in the 1960s is we actually see a flurry of innovation, attempts to really get ahead in cartridge technology. Starting off with the Tround. This was based off of a military experiment in which it was found that triangular-shaped ammunition stacked better in a magazine, about 50% better in a magazine. You fit 50% more ammunition if it was triangularly shaped in a magazine. However, the issue that they ran into was trying to get the round from the magazine into the chamber, and it would be abandoned by the military, not by a fellow named Dardick, who decided that the Tround was definitely the next evolution in ammunition, and he would go on to develop it further, even creating a handgun to go along with it. He would also create adapters so that already existing handguns could utilize his Tround. Or at least existing ammo types could also be utilized with his Tround. Unfortunately for him, the gun didn't really take off. Something else that we run into during the 1960s is the SPIW or SPIW program, in which the military was trying to figure out how to be able to have flatter shooting, higher velocity, more rapid firing options out there. They were looking very heavily at flechettes. That was kind of like the whole basis of this overall conversation. So it started off with like loading shotgun shells with flechettes, and then it would be followed up by experimenting with like fitting a flechette into a .308 round, and on and on and on from there. However, it never really took off. While they got some fantastic penetration, there were accuracy issues. Yes, a flechette is a very lightweight projectile, but There was a lot of like interesting stuff going on with flechettes during this time period as it is. So of course you have 2.75 rockets, as well as the Beehive rounds that were utilized by the United States military during Vietnam. And then you also have innovations like the Lazy Dog, which again is not something that we're necessarily going to get into right now, but are interesting kind of snapshots as what it was for the thinking at the time. Very passive means of being able to defeat large numbers of enemy. And the SPIW program would pretty much go away. And then we have the Gyrojets, which if anybody's ever seen Sean Connery's James Bond film, You Only Live Twice, they're very familiar with rocket guns. So this was a type of ammunition in which you had a small rocket motor set along with a projectile. So a rocket motor being made up of whatever your warhead is, or excuse me, a rocket being made up of a rocket motor and some type of warhead. That was then loaded into a pistol, and they were gyrojets because they were actually canted venturis in order to be able to impart spin to the projectile. They also, oddly enough, didn't take off that well either, other than in that movie where apparently they're like the greatest thing in the world. Not to give anything away, but Sean Connery has one hidden inside of a cigarette. It's pretty cool. I guess you can call that a lucky strike. Anyway, bad jokes aside, our next most notable ammunition development, keep in mind guys, like the Trounds were plastic. Winchester, I believe it was Winchester at this time, was also experimenting with like aluminum cased shotgun shells. There was a lot of innovation happening with not just like ammunition design, but also materials that were being utilized, because plastics and aluminums were kind of the future at this point, and we already see that with the M16 and all those types of things. The next big advancement in self-contained cartridge technology would be the HKG-11 program, which was a late 80s development in an attempt to produce an ammunition that was caseless. So you had no different than some of the early like linen cartridges that we're talking about for like the Sharps rifle. You have a cartridge that is made up entirely of propellant with a projectile set into it and a primer in there. And when it fires, it completely consumes itself and sends the round down range, diminishing the overall number of moving parts, which has an added benefit of being able to increase rate of fire, as well as capacity, reliability, all those types of things. The Germans wound up dropping the program, however, when the Cold War ended and Germany reunited. Since then, there's not been too much innovation in that direction, but it is a conversation that comes up every once in a while. Now, something I remember learning about as a kid on the History Channel, when the History Channel still talked about like history, was electrically initiated ammunition. Now, electrically initiated ammunition is not necessarily a new concept. It's actually used quite extensively in autocannons, 20 millimeter and higher, and tank guns and stuff like that, which you use an electric current to be able to ignite an electrically initiated detonator or electro-explosive device, EED, to then send the round down range. You see it in like aircraft cannons. There was an attempt at one point for a 4-barrel pistol that you could load up the barrels with a bunch of this ammunition and they would be fired sequentially down the barrel. So they're literally stacked in the barrel waiting to go, and they're waiting for an electrical charge in order to be able to send them down range. It seems like this has kind of petered out. I haven't heard a whole lot of reference to it here in the last couple of decades, honestly. And that's probably for the best, because it looks like an incredibly complicated system that would probably be very expensive and would not necessarily catch on very quickly in the civilian sector. Why would I abandon my 9mm to get this very expensive gun with very expensive ammunition? Especially when you talk about something that somehow, like it's some sort of centrifuged ammo at that point, in order for, you've got 15 rounds loaded in there in order to make sure that round number 1 goes, instead of accidentally discharging round number 9 and it colliding against the 8 rounds in front of it. Like that seems very dangerous. Seems like a very risky aspect at that point, and then very expensive on top of it. For the most part, it seems like ammunition has kind of stagnated in its development, with the exception of the 277 Fury, or as it's known in military parlance, the 6.8 by 51. This is a new adoption by the United States military that brings back rifle cartridges onto, and main battle rifles into the military sphere. And this cartridge is supposed to be basically a .277 diameter projectile, generating 80,000 psi, which is incredibly high. So of course, Murph, that means you must have a very stout cartridge to be able to handle this. Well, kind of. It's actually a bimaterial cartridge. And I say bimaterial because this is not like we're talking about like steel-cased ammunition that was developed in the early 1900s for militaries and stuff like that. This is an ammunition that has like a stainless steel case head and then a plastic body in order to reduce weight. One of the issues with going to a full power rifle cartridge like the 308 or something along those lines is not only do you have diminished capacity, but you also have increased weight. So you're carrying less ammunition in the same overall space, but potentially more weight because of the size of the ammunition. By going to a plastic cartridge casing, you change that dynamic. Now, as far as I understand it, the ammunition that's being issued out for training right now for units that have received the new XM, whatever it is that we're calling it right now, what we would call the SIG Spear Heavy in civilian parlance, is still coming out with conventional cased ammunition. It is not they are not necessarily issuing the plastic ammunition. I suspect they're having some issues because you are still talking about some fairly significant pressures, and then also this ammunition being environmentally sound. I imagine that's going to take a lot of checking, especially like when you get into Arctic conditions and making sure that plastic doesn't get so brittle that it breaks. But only time will tell on how that ammunition will pay off long term. All right, guys. I think that pretty much covers my thoughts on this particular subject. I hope you guys found this interesting. That's pretty much what I got. Have a good day.